And it's pretty amazing. People seem to be really interested in invasive species control and management. Today we have at least 26 people who have registered. This represents 16 U.S. states. 16. We actually have 6 people from Washington State representing the Nature Conservancy, Chelan County Noxious Weed Control Board, who they probably know Sheila Kennedy really well. Clark Public Utilities in Vancouver, Washington, the Quinault Indian Nation in Washington State. We have Vermont representing the Montpelier Parks, USDA Forest Service from Vermont, and Utah, and the Southwest Conservation District from Corvallis, Oregon. We have USDA APHIS, where I worked for 22 years before I transferred over to USGS. In North Carolina, represented today, we have someone from New York, National Park Service in Missouri, the Grand Traverse Regional Land Conservancy in Michigan, USDA ARS in Beltsville, Maryland. We have a friend here from the Kansas Department of Agriculture, National Park Service from Kansas, and the Latah Water and Conservation District from Moscow, Idaho. We have Florida and Colorado also represented, and then U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Bureau of Land Management from Alaska. So I just want you to keep in mind that this technology is an amazing thing, that we can have 26 people, 28 including Steve and I, who actually can have a meeting like this and share ideas with each other from all over the U.S. and Canada. But what is even more amazing today is we have 2 more people who are here from Lisbon, Portugal, and Wales, Swansea University in the United Kingdom. I was just amazed when I saw that. So they're coming up on 5 p.m. Right after that, their time over there in Europe. And we want to especially thank you for taking the time to join us over here in the U.S. for this. So this is going to be the 4th session of our EDRR series. We're going to talk about rapid assessment guidelines of suspected new invaders today. I want to start out, as I usually do with these seminars, to tell you how this all evolved over the last 55 years to the point of having the landscape approach to EDRR. It started in 1957 when witchweed, the Striga asiatica, was detected here in southeastern North Carolina, about 10 miles from our research station here. And that was one of the original federal noxious weeds, and it's our original single agency-led federal state weed eradication program, led by the USDA, originally ARS, and then passed over to APHIS in 1972. And so it's led now by North Carolina Department of Agriculture and by APHIS in South Carolina. So this is what I call EDRR 1.0. That means that these are single agency-led programs such as Cogon grass, which is an eradication program here that North Carolina Department of Agriculture is leading to eradicate Cogon grass from Pender County. The idea is for Al Tasker there with APHIS is to eradicate anything from the United States. The idea for Rick Iverson is to eradicate anything he can from North Carolina. And that is how I spent most of my career working on those kind of programs like goat shrew in Utah and Japanese daughter up at Clemson University in their arboretum. These are single agency-led programs. This led in the late 90s when I met Steve Manning to expand this idea to an interagency approach, because I think that the issue that I've always run into in dealing with plants like goat shrew in Utah and common crepina in Idaho and hydrilla in California is that these agencies constantly changing their priorities as new administrations come in, whether they're governors or presidents. They have new priorities, and they tell the BLM and the USDA that they have different priorities for their programs. And so what we found was a need to create an interagency approach to EDRR, and that's exactly what we did when we started encouraging folks to form these state and provincial invasive species councils, such as the Delaware Invasive Species Council in 1998, and then the Carolinas Beach Vitex Task Force which we formed in 2003. We call this EDRR 2.0. So when I retired last year, after working on this approach at the single agency-led programs and the interagency approach to EDRR, Steve Manning suggested that we might take this concept one step further. We call this EDRR 3.0, which means that we want people to take responsibility for the land they own or manage, whether it's a state, a nation, a county, a city, a town, a refuge, a park, or your own backyard. It doesn't matter, because the reason we have so many problems now is that we have allowed things like English ivy and kudzu and oriental bittersweet to get so widespread that they're now a permanent part of the landscape. But just think back to 1876 when they were introducing kudzu into the United States at the Philadelphia Centennial, the 100th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence of the United States, when they actually introduced kudzu as an ornamental porch vine and then later used it for erosion control. Wouldn't it be nice if we could go back to about 1877 and say, you know, this is a pretty plant. It's got a beautiful flower. It smells like grape Kool-Aid, you know, when you have it on a trellis on your porch. It just won't stay where you put it. That's the problem, and that is why these assessments, these pest risk assessments, are so critical in the agencies that do these things for their lands or from a regulatory standpoint. The work they're doing is so critically important to managing and knowing what to manage in terms of invasive species. So this is what we call the landscape approach to EDRR, which we're focused on now. Whatever level you're working at, we want people to take responsibility, especially at the local level. So the question is, where do you and your friends and partners fit into this picture? Somewhere between the national level and down to where you live, there's opportunities to do early detection, rapid response. But along the way, you've got to figure out how you're actually going to do that. So we have 7 steps, which means to get organized, figure out, once you figure out the area that you're talking about, whether it's a state or a county or a municipality, whether it's a park, whether it's a farm or a ranch, it doesn't matter. Just figure that out. Then you need to get organized and figure out who your stakeholders are, do a work plan, put more eyes on the ground, look around, start doing surveys, manage your field data, report this, and then assess the problem and take rapid response for action. And so this is what our series is about right here. And today we're going to talk about the steps you can take to assess the problem. First of all, I wanted to talk to you about determining how you could see whether you need to do an assessment. And if you've not ever heard of Rod Randall, here's someone I'd like for you to look up on Google, do a Google search. He is actually a weed geographer. I've known him for almost 20 years, and he's with the Western Australia Department of Agriculture. And there's a book that Rod has written over the past 20 years, and the second edition just came out last year, called The Global Compendium of Weeds. And what I'd like for you to do, you can actually just type this in on a Google search, and you'll go to the Western Australia Department of Agriculture, to one of their web pages, and you can actually find this link right here. And you can actually get this book for free. It's about, I think, about 1,200 pages now. It's a huge book. So I've got some copies of it from about 2001, and in those days he had documented 22,000 species of weeds. Now he's up to 33,759 as of early January. I don't know how many he has exactly right now. This is worldwide. So the place I would start to determine whether, if you have something new that looks like it might be a problem, is pull out the Global Compendium of Weeds by Rod Randall in Western Australia. Because these are documented. He has citations with each one. So it's a good place to start to see, has anybody ever documented the plant that you're beginning to be concerned about? So once you do that and it appears that you have an issue, the next thing you want to see is whether it's regulated by anybody, by the county you live in, by the state you live in, or the province you live in, or by the country you live in. Now, if it's not, then we have a set of guidelines that we can give you to do a general rapid assessment. This is not from a regulatory standpoint, but if you really just want to get a good idea of what you're faced with, you can do a general rapid assessment, an evaluation of new exotic plants for invasiveness. And basically, here's a template with 12 parts, which goes into the identity, the biology, ecology, current distribution, history of invasiveness, basically all these things, pathways of introduction and spread. It's a real nice report when you get through, so that if you say, okay, I've got this plant and I'm wondering about it, and you do this report, then you can send this to people and say, here is all the background information. Now let's get together and talk about what to do. Now later on, after you get together and decide that it is going to be regulated by your state or by your country, they're going to do an official pest risk assessment, which is much more detailed than what I'm talking about right here. So I wanted to tell you one of my experiences with using a pest risk assessment, a weed risk assessment that was actually developed by APHIS a long time ago for the prohibited listing system. And if you didn't know, probably you've never heard, I used to work for APHIS from 1979 until 2000. At first as a port inspector in the Port of Charleston, and eventually I was the APHIS National Weed Program Coordinator from 1996 until 2000. And back in those days, and until just a few years ago, when they developed a new pest risk assessment protocol, we were using a pest risk assessment process that I want to describe for you just a little bit, but as to how we actually used this thing back in 2006. Going before that, in 2003, I was called by some folks down in South Carolina who said they had a plant, which is beech Vitex rotundifolia, which is native to Korea. And so they asked me to come down and look at it because no one in South Carolina from the agencies or the universities seemed to be very interested in it. It wasn't an aquatic weed. It wasn't an agricultural weed. It just didn't seem to fit anywhere. So eventually we called together a group of stakeholders and formed the Carolina Beech Vitex Task Force. It's been a very successful effort to eradicate this particular plant, which is native to Korea, which was introduced by the North Carolina State University Arboretum in about 1985 for dune restoration projects along the coast here. It actually has a really beautiful flower, and so people started planting it as a flower on their front dunes. And it turned out by the mid-90s that it was just not panning out the way they thought it would be, and so that in the late 90s, actually 1998, I was called by a fellow named Tommy Socia with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and Tommy told me about this plant and said this thing is not turning out to be like they thought it was. It has these deep tap roots that go down, which hold it very well in storms, but it has no fibrous roots. And so it is allowing the beaches to wash away, and so all the millions of dollars we're doing with dune restoration is going down the drain. And so could you come down and look at it? And so we actually did in August 1998, which this year would be 15 years ago. It's hard to believe. Time has gone so fast. And so this is an example of a plant that you would do a pest risk assessment on. So when I came back and talked to the folks in APHIS in Washington right away, it appeared that no one else besides the Corps of Engineers was really that interested in this plant. It had not started causing a lot of serious problems as it has come to cause since then. So by the time I heard about it again in 2003 from these from these sea turtle volunteers who said this thing is washing the dunes away, letting the dunes wash away. We formed this task force. And then very quickly after that, that was in 2003. In 2004, 5 and 6, I started doing a pest risk assessment using the APHIS weed risk assessment protocol. And this thing is really based, well, let's say that model of it back in those days was based on the likelihood of introduction and the consequences of introduction and the overall pest risk potential. So they ask you to answer a lot of questions in these three categories, and ultimately you come up with a score, high, medium, etc. And based on that, you can decide whether something like this will be listed as a federal noxious weed in the United States. In this case, it certainly ranked high enough to be listed, but there was one kink in the problem with the whole thing that prevented APHIS from listing this, and that was that if you go back in the literature, if you look at some of the botany books from Hawaii, this thing had been in Hawaii for a long time, and so technically speaking, was said to be native to Hawaii. But honestly, folks, can anything be native to Hawaii? I guess it's just a matter of what you decide as whether it can be or not. Actually, this is native to Korea. And the distance between Korea and Hawaii is 4,600 miles of open ocean. Now, somehow these seeds got there either in the bottom of a boat with people or sitting on a log that floated across the ocean. I don't know how it got there, but eventually it got there, and it's been there a really long time. So it's become naturalized for sure. But it's a technicality that says that no matter what you say about a weed in Hawaii, if it is said to be native to there, it's not going to be listed as a federal noxious weed. And so that was a big disappointment for the task force, but it actually was listed as a state noxious weed in North Carolina. It, believe it or not, was never listed as a state noxious weed in South Carolina because the nursery industry protested to the Department of Agriculture because they said they wanted to sell it, even though they know it causes these problems on the dunes. It was also listed as a state noxious weed in Virginia, probably about 5 or 6 years ago. And it was always, when they did the listings at the state level, they used the pest risk assessment that I did in 2006. Actually, it was 2005, and I actually gave it to the task force in 2006 before we knew whether it could ever be listed as a federal noxious weed. And so this is really calls up the idea that even if you have tools to do these kinds of assessments, which I think they're really good tools, you have to look at the laws themselves, because in the case of the Federal Noxious Weed Act, which is now superseded by the Plant Protection Act of 2000, and so it's actually incorporated into that law in 2000, it actually says that if something is considered to be native in any of the 50 states, then you can't list it. So that means that something that is right above Vancouver, Washington, which is one of the people visiting with us today is from Vancouver. If you're up there in Vancouver, British Columbia, and you have a plant up there, you can list it a mile away from the border. But if you want to have something from Hawaii that is considered native to Hawaii, you can't list it, even though it's 2,400 miles off the coast of California. So that's an issue with the laws themselves. So sometimes even when we have good tools, like we do, our laws themselves become the limitation. It has nothing to do with what people want to do. It has to do with what the kind of laws and how they're set up and what we can do under the laws. Now, APHIS has always had a prohibited listing approach, which means that you can't keep beach phytex out of the country in 1985 unless it's officially listed or prohibited as a federal noxious weed. That's the way it's been. And I think not too long ago they changed, or were in the process of changing, Quarantine 37 to be able to require that anything that looks like it's going to be a problem, any kind of plant for planting, like, of course, beach phytex. If beach phytex are being introduced now, I think that under this new regulation under Quarantine 37, they probably could require that it be assessed. So you can actually find the risk assessment I did under the beach phytex Task Force website there. It's on. If you click on one of the columns to find out information about Beach Phytex, you can actually download it. And I've got a couple of versions of the thing, some with pictures. So if you're interested in seeing that pest risk assessment I did for Beach Phytex, I'd be more than happy to share it with you if you can't find it on that website. Okay. The next type of weed risk assessment system that has been developed over the past 20 years is the permitted listing system that the Australian Quarantine Inspection Service has developed. And AQUIS is essentially equivalent to the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service in the United States, except they still do the border clearance and pest exclusion at ports of entry. So in the early 90s, they developed a new system which basically said that you're going to have to do, if you want to import something that is new, that's never been here, of all these 700,000 plants around the world that we don't already have, then you need to do an assessment to prove it's going to be okay. And I really like this system because you can put it all on one page. Now, it takes you more than a day to do it, obviously, but it's got 49 questions, and each one of them is like a yes or a no or a score. If it's a yes, it's like a -1 or a +1 or something. Anyway, so you come down to the end and you get a score, and if it's less than 1, then you accept it and say it doesn't look like it's going to be a problem. If it's 1 to 6, you got to evaluate it more. If it's higher than a 6, you're going to reject it. And so when we use this to evaluate Beach Phytex in 2006, 2007, it scored really high, like a 20. So I'm not sure. I don't believe Beach Phytex is actually native to to Australia. It's actually native to, like, I believe it does occur in the Philippines and maybe some of the islands. But this would be a perfect plant since we've had such problems with it here. This would be an ideal plant to be listed as a prohibited or weed in Australia. And I'm not sure whether they have ever done that, because they certainly know the kind of things we've worked on here as far as Beach Phytex goes. So I wanted to just close this out by giving you some examples of some of the plants that we have dealt with over the years that, had we had one of these systems to begin with, it might have made a lot of difference in terms of what, if we could have shown with documentation what was going to happen with these plants, maybe there would have been more attention paid to it. And the first one that comes to mind is hydrilla. And we've got a really serious problem here in southeastern North Carolina at Lake Waccamaw with a new infestation of hydrilla. This is a natural Carolina beta, so it's 9,000 acres. It's no more than 11 feet deep. And these pictures that I've shown these folks from Florida, which right here, show what this thing can do in a shallow body of water. But I wanted to, the reason I brought this up to you today is to take you back to 1947. When and we have one person here from the National Park Service in Missouri, so I was thinking of things that we could relate to each state that you represent today. And so there was a man named Otto von Lim, and I don't know exactly the name of his company, but apparently he had a water garden company, and he sold aquatic plants in St. Louis, Missouri. So he went over to Ceylon, which at that time, and this is Sri Lanka, then called Ceylon, and he found this plant called hydrilla. And so at that time, of course, there were no laws at all about bringing this in. They just probably inspected it as it came in on the plane at the international airport, probably into St. Louis, and took it out there and found out fairly quickly that it wouldn't grow well in Missouri, and it was just too cold. So he sent it to a friend down in Florida, near Tampa, who said, "This looks so much like elodea. Why do we need this plant?" So he threw it out back into a canal, and the rest is history. And so it became a problem, and they started selling it in aquariums and water gardens in the 1950s in Florida. And it's just such a big problem now all over the southern tier of the states of the United States, and it's actually been found up in Connecticut. And so just imagine what we could have avoided if we had one of these pest risk assessment processes in place in 1947 when he came in and they said, well, do you have a permit for this? Has it been assessed? Well, no. Then we wouldn't have all these issues that we have now in dealing with hydrilla forever, like at Lake Waccamaw. It's going to cost us $450,000 a year to control this thing with chemicals because the Wildlife Resources Commission here in North Carolina has refused to give a permit at all to put grass carp into this lake, which I can't blame them because we have a number of endemic species in this natural 30,000-year-old lake. But it's really just too bad that Otto von Linn did not do an assessment back in 1947 when he thought he found something so good. We have another person today on the line from Kansas Department of Agriculture, which called to mind when I used to work with Bill Scott, who was the state weed coordinator back in the 90s, and a plant that they were working on then, Grecian foxglove, which was an ornamental in Wilson County, and there's where Wilson County is in Kansas. And I don't know the status of it right now, except it is still a prohibited noxious weed in Kansas. And this is poisonous to cattle. So that is one reason when it escaped from this nursery in that county there, and realized that it did so well in the tallgrass prairies out there that they decided they better regulate it, and so they did. I don't know of any other state that actually has regulated this, but when you start having a problem with something like this and there's no history of invasiveness, like there was no history of invasiveness for beech vitex, there was none for hydrilla, say, in 1947. There definitely wasn't any for Grecian foxglove back in the early 90s when I first heard about this and talking to Bill Scott from the Kansas Department of Agriculture. Another one here is we got folks on the line from Idaho. We got one person from Idaho. We've got at least one person on the line from Oregon. And a plant that you're going to have to deal with forever from now on is something that we were trying to think about eradicating back in the early 80s, and that is common crepina. This is a plant that came from Spain, probably accidentally. I don't think it was introduced on purpose with sheep herders who came over from Spain to work in Idaho and Oregon. This was first noticed in 1968 near Grangeville, Idaho. It was identified in 1969, and in 1970 they figured out that it had 40 acres infested. By the time I started working on this thing in 1981, there were 23,000 acres in Idaho and Oregon that were infested, and so in 1982 the University of Idaho at Moscow with Don Till and Bob Callahan started doing an eradication feasibility study. But what I'm really wondering is how it would have been different if we'd had an assessment process so that we could have done an assessment in 1970. So it's awful easy to look back and see these things and we can't change it. But we're now to the point where we've gone through all these ideas and things that happened here up through 2001. We're to the point of hoping and praying for a biological control agent because we can never get rid of it. So I think these assessments are so critical to be used when people are wanting to bring these things in our countries, just to make sure that we're not getting a mess. And like I said, if you start with a global compendium of weeds and say, does it have a history? That's a great starting point. I think I've got one more that I want to just mention to you, and that is we started working with eradicating goat shrew about 1981, about the same time as we did crepina in Idaho. We started working with this in Cache County, Utah, and we have one person today from the Forest Service in Utah. So Jack Evans, who's featured right there in the picture, a professor from Utah State University, actually was in charge of this program, and from 1981 until 1996, they got $150,000 a year to do an eradication program. This was actually based on the fact that a professor had introduced this plant in 1891 to be used as a range forage plant. And it is a legume, and the only thing they didn't realize is it was poisonous. So when they figured out it was poisonous to cattle, they just abandoned their research plots there at the university, and the rest is history. By 1970, they had 40,000 acres in Cache County, and I don't know what has happened to it since then. But the thing that would be nice is if in 1991 we had one of these pest risk assessment processes, so that when this professor said, yes, I think this looks like a good plant, sort of like alfalfa, maybe it will be our next alfalfa, then we actually do an assessment and determine, is this a good idea or not? Here we are in 2013, and because we lost funding for this program in 1996, I imagine that whatever progress we made from 1981 until 96 has been lost. The other thing an assessment would do, I would say if you ever do an assessment like this, is look at seed longevity. Because the thing now that I look back on that I wish I had even thought of back in the early to mid 80s when I started working on this was how long do the seeds last? And the seeds of this plant last 50 years. So you've got to be realistic and ask, okay, we've got 40,000 acres. You're eradicating witchweed from North Carolina. It's got 430,000 acres. So this doesn't seem so big. But we have a way to actually do suicidal germination of witchweed seeds in the soil with ethylene gas. Well, that won't work for goat's rue. And so that is why these assessments, again, if we had an assessment back in 1891, we would have said, absolutely not. This thing will last 50 years in the soil. It's going to be impossible to ever, it's poisonous to cattle. It's going to be impossible to ever eradicate, mainly because nobody will be around to finish the program. So anyway, just to sort of go back through it, how this fits into the bigger picture, the 7 steps for developing EDRR capacity. To get organized, develop an early detection network, do surveys of all your natural and managed resources, submit your field data to an online database like the University of Georgia Early Detection, Distribution, and Mapping System, and do it with an iPhone or Android phone app. And this is the neatest thing that I have seen in my career that has come along in terms of technology. We can actually go out in the field and take a picture and get GPS coordinates and submit that directly where you're standing in the middle of the patch to the University of Georgia or someplace else on the internet with an online database. And then once you decide you're going to manage something, take a look at IPC Online Smart Tools with IPC Connect, IPC Prevent. Finally, tell somebody about it. The way we heard about Cogon grass here in Pender County last May, and immediately assembled a group of experts there at that site. And so now it's just business as usual as we go about eradicating a half acre of Cogon grass, the very first infestation known to be in North Carolina, which means that if we keep looking for Cogon grass and keep eradicating these small spots, it won't ever cause the impacts that it is having right now in Georgia and Alabama and Mississippi. Really huge impacts on timber production in those three states down there. And finally, and to assess the problem as we have discussed today. And finally, if the assessment says do something, make a plan. And that's what we're going to talk about with our next webinar next week, the details of actually forming a partnership or launching a single agency-led program. So what I'm going to do is go through next week and look at the steps we've taken with various programs like goat's rue, Crepina, witchweed here in the Carolinas, hydrilla down in the Imperial Valley in California, Southern California, how that actually worked, what did not work, what has worked with the Beach Vitex task force and other interagency task forces that are doing EDR 2.0, and finally, EDRR 3.0, the landscape approach, which we hope you'll all start helping us promote, which means that every landowner everywhere is going to take responsibility. And it doesn't matter whether a weed is regulated. If it's new on your land, in your park, in your forest, on your ranch, in your backyard, it doesn't matter. This is your kingdom. Then you need to make sure that you never have another new weed. Never, ever again. And if everybody did that, we wouldn't have any new invasive species problems. And that is sort of like a land conservation ethic based on the Aldo Leopold concepts from the Sand County Almanac book that he wrote back in the 1930s and 40s that I hope you will take a look at, because I really feel like that we cannot depend on the government agencies anymore because of all the austerity measures they're having to go through in Canada and the U.S. and other countries too. The money is just not there to do these projects like we've done over the last 50 years. So there's going to be some program money for things like witchweed, which is going to carry on. They're funding the witchweed eradication program here in the Carolinas to the tune of still $800,000 a year. But all the other programs have been zeroed out. It's not because the agencies don't want to do this. It's because they don't have the money. The money is just not there. So wherever we can, we need to get at the lowest level of land management of those people to embrace EDRR, so that you're drawing a line in the sand and saying no new weeds, no new weeds. And it's a whole lot easier and less complicated than dealing with 100 million acres of cheatgrass, which is what we're dealing with in the West. You can do this through an in-house program with your volunteers or a dedicated staff, or you can outsource it to a company like IPC. We have folks who can help you develop all these 7 steps for EDRR. So I wanted to take a look at this one last time in passing, the landscape approach to EDRR, and think about where you fit in here. Right here is Bob Parsons. I didn't mention Bob a while ago. But Steve and I have known Bob Parsons since the early 90s, and he's the weed coordinator, the superintendent for Park County in Wyoming, which is where Yellowstone National Park is. And so this is a picture of Bob with the plant of Dyer's Woad. What's unique about this is it's an application of the landscape approach to EDRR because he found a single plant in Park County, and he got rid of it. He could have sat there and watched it grow for the next 20 years, and it would be just like the infestation of the Dyer's Woad, which are in Utah. Now, I remember when I was out there working on goat's rue, and we heard about Dyer's Woad, and they said folks could remember back in maybe the 1950s and 60s when they said there was very little Dyer's Woad there. But by the time the 1980s came along, it was too late. You couldn't get rid of it. And so eradicating Dyer's Woad from Park County, Utah is an example of the landscape approach to EDRR. Eradicating Kogon grass from North Carolina is an example of the landscape approach to EDRR at the state level. Eradicating witchweed from the United States, which we are so close, we have about 1,500 acres left out of 432,000 acres that were infested in 1957. We're down to 1,500 acres. We're so close. But take that on down to the level of the city or a ranch or a park or a lake or even like hydrilla at Lake Waccamaw. We can't eradicate hydrilla from the United States, but if we work hard enough, we can eradicate it from Lake Waccamaw right here. So I want to invite you to come to our